All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I probably have too many slides today, so we're going to try to get through as many of them as I can before we.
Chapter 5.
This is chapter 5, Living the Sermon on the Mount in Difficult Times. Chapter 5, Jesus affirms the law and the prophets. Hopefully everybody had a chance to look at that a little bit. So the first part of the class, I'm going to go over some things that aren't in the book, and this is Law of Moses 101. So, just some basics about what we know about the Mosaic Law, and then we'll talk about what's actually in our chapter today that Brother Bolton brings to us.
Okay.
So let's begin with a question, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but if you have any prior assumptions or beliefs about the relationship of Jesus with the Mosaic Law, what might those be?
And he knew it very well.
He knew it very well. Okay.
It was what he knew as a child.
He grew up with it. Okay. By that.
He
probably just knew it.
He was what?
He was Jewish.
He was Jewish and a good follower of the law.
He was literate enough to be able to read from the scroll in the temple.
He was literate enough to read from the scroll, which at that time literacy rates were very, very low. And so it would be unusual to have somebody in the village who could do that. And so some scholars would say, well, he probably had some training even as a rabbi. And certainly his disciples at times called him rabbi. So, anything else?
Don't you have a feeling that it was divinely given? His talents for reading was divinely given? I've always felt like his knowing how to read from the scrolls was divinely given.
I don't have any basis for that.
I don't either. I just feel that.
Yeah. I've not heard
It's not in the Bible. It's not anywhere, but
Well, he's a human being, so he learned to read like all of us.
like it was.
A human being learned to read like all of us. I would say one other thing I could say was that I think he understood the intent of the law of Jesus.
Okay, so he had some maybe higher level, third level understandings about the law more than just keeping the law word for word as it's written. David, did you want to say something?
No, they were waving.
Oh, you're waving. Hi. Okay.
Since I've been qualified. Yeah. Lawyer.
Do you have something?
I suspect at the end of the day, he wasn't particularly enthralled with the Mosaic law.
Okay. You may not have been. We'll kind of circle back to that and talk about a little bit later.
One of the big rabbis alive during his time was Hillel the Elder. So I've heard that he might have studied with him. I think that's something that somebody positive.
Yeah, and I think the Apostle Paul, somewhere in one of his writings, or maybe in the book of Acts, it talks about Paul sitting at the feet of Hillel.
Gamaliel.
Or Gamaliel. I'm sorry, you're right. Yeah. Okay. So something to be thinking about, because we'll come back to this a little bit later on, but as we're going through the first part of the slides about the law, think about, was there ever in a time that you can remember in the New Testament when Jesus knowingly broke the Mosaic law? Okay.
Yeah.
We'll see what you remember. We'll see what you remember. Okay. So the next 6 or 7 slides, I'm just going to try to zoom through these real quick. What do we know about the Mosaic law? First of all, what is it that we consider to be Mosaic law? The focus is on delineating relationships between humans and God, and we'll explain in a minute why that's important. And of course, the word Torah in Hebrew literally means law. So the Mosaic law in Hebrew is Torah Moshe. Moshe is the name for Moses. There is a lot of cultural influences in ancient law, and that certainly is the case in the Mosaic law. Scholars would say that the law reflects ancient Near Eastern legal traditions and customs of the time. And what other ancient laws were in existence when the Torah was written? There was the Code of Ur-Nammu. This is from Samaria, which is the area who came from Samaria? Abraham. Okay, so that's where Abraham was supposed to have come from. The Code of Ur-Nammu was written around 2100 to 2050 BCE. And then most of us have probably heard, I know Jane has heard of this, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, written about 760 BCE. And an interesting fact for Jane is that 50% of the Code of Hammurabi is contract law. It dealt with how people
Lovely.
buy and sell and exchange.
I think they had it towards that.
Probably a lot of them.
Contract.
Anyway, because of similarities between these two laws and the Mosaic law, there is believed to have been at least some influence from these more ancient manuscripts. So when was the Mosaic law written? What's the traditional view?
When Moses was alive.
I was gonna say that.
You didn't talk about it enough.
So the
Yeah.
Mosaic law is traditionally attributed to Moses around 1446 to 1406 BCE, but now most scholars believe that the earliest elements of the law actually began to develop much later, probably around the 7th century BCE during the reign of King Josiah.
Moses wasn't alive.
It's likely that the writing occurred over several centuries, and it reflected changing social norms and legal beliefs, which, one might expect to have happened. Times change, and there's a need for new laws to be added or old laws maybe to be revised or updated. Some scholars suggest that the books organized now as the Torah, now we're talking about the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, are much, much younger than previously thought. And the only documented copy of the Law of Moses in its relatively present form that we have currently is from the 2nd century BCE. And that was discovered with the scrolls at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, if any of you got to see that at the Union Station. So the answer is we don't know. Again, many people will hold to the tradition that this came from Moses, more likely that it was an evolving effort. A lot of it probably written during the Babylonian captivity. That was a time of very prolific writing in Judaism because the people had been taken away from their homeland into a foreign country. And there was a need to begin documenting for future generations, what exactly the beliefs and understandings of the people were about God. So it makes sense that some of this could have been, certainly written during that time. So the 2nd century thing is only because that's the most current discovery that we have. There may be earlier copies that someday somebody will find and we'll see. So what was different about the Law of Moses compared to other laws of ancient times? Well, the Law of Moses in ancient Israel was different from the other legal codes in the Near East because the transgressions that were introduced into the law were seen as offenses against God by Judaism. Whereas the other codes were, if you committed a crime, it was considered an offense against the country or the legal system of that country. So they weren't seen as offenses against society, but rather offenses against God. So that was unique about the Law of Moses as far as we know. And it makes sense because the Law of Moses, as we understand it, is based on the covenant that Israel felt that they had with God. If you will have me as your God, you will be my people. That early covenant that was established between Israel and the Lord. So what kind of things are covered in the Mosaic Law? Some of these you probably know. The 10 Commandments is very commonly quoted. Other moral laws that also dealt with problems like murder, theft, honesty, and adultery. Social laws that governed ownership of property, inheritance, passing property from parents to children, marriage, and divorce. There are, of course, food and purity laws, what was considered to be clean and unclean, both with respect to the food itself and then the preparation of the food, and then also people with diseases were, that type of uncleanliness was defined. The Mosaic Law covers the feast days, things like Passover, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. More feast days were added as time went on, so some of the ones that may exist in Judaism today may not all be in there. It covers sacrifices, how to perform sacrifices, giving of offerings and tithes, and various instructions to the priests. And then other rules for clergy with respect to the physical structure of the temple, how to build a tabernacle, how to build a temple, what the altars have to look like and where they have to be placed and who can have access to them and so forth. There's a lot in there. Okay. This is just a fun fact that I found about the Mosaic Law. According to the Rabbi Similai, I guess, who lived in Galilee in the 3rd century, so this is approximately 250 years after Jesus, or no, 150 years after Jesus, I guess. The Mosaic Law encompassed a broad spectrum of 613 commandments, and we've probably heard that information before. And Rabbi Similai divided that into 365 prohibitions. So here's the things you can't do. Okay.
You can sit
Yeah.
in
Easy
a
to
chair.
remember.
He believed, what's that?
Easy to remember.
Easy to
That's what
remember.
I-
So he believed that God gave it that way because it corresponded to the number of days in the year.
Do they
Okay.
have days like that?
Almost
I
easier.
don't know, the calendar in the
calendar
3rd
was a-
century, if they had 360
Almost
days or
easier
not.
to list the things that you can do.
The things that were, the positive things, the positive commandments were 248 in number. And he believed at that time in history that these mirrored the number of bones in the human body. There's actually 206. So
Yeah.
he was only off by about 42 months. But it's kind of an interesting
Wait
fact.
a minute, who's that guy? That's not the Rabbi Similai.
That's Rabbi Similai.
That was finished. She's right
Good
there.
photo.
What's that?
That's a really good photo from the 3rd century.
As well as blue jeans.
No, that's a modern photo.
It is.
And then the number of commandments are reflected in the number of tassel strands in the prayer shawl. If you can kind of see these down here, if you separated them all out. I guess in a good prayer shawl, you'd have 613 strands. That would help you to remember all the laws when you had your shawl on. Okay, that's Mosaic Law 101. Now we're going to talk about the chapter itself, and it's based on this scripture from Matthew, which says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So what stands out for you in this passage? What do you think Jesus is saying?
He's here to fulfill the law,
Okay, that he's here to fulfill the law. Okay.
and that the law still stands.
The law still stands. So he's advocating very strongly, it sounds to me. I mean, he could have said that just once, obey the law, but then he has to go into all this, punishment and who's going to be kicked out of the kingdom and who's going to make it in. And only the people that follow the law are going to make it into the
He's
kingdom.
going to make that dig against the scribes and Pharisees.
Always a dig.
Well, and, we've read about that in Amy Jill Levine's books, how sometimes the negative spin that the Gospels put on the scribes and Pharisees is probably related to how the early church felt toward them more so than how Jesus felt about them.
Right.
And she said, surely, there must have been good scribes and Pharisees, people who meant well and were trying to do the right thing. So
That kind of negates, though, the idea that you're saved by grace.
wow. We're coming back to that. Do you have any questions or concerns about Jesus' statement?
We just heard a big one.
Does it come in conflict? We won't answer the question now, but keep that in your mind. Does it come into conflict with Christian belief then?
I've always wondered if of those 613 rules, if they are all still in effect, because he says not one jot or tittle will be changed.
Yeah.
It doesn't quite seem accurate based on the life of Jesus.
Well, with the destruction of the temple, you lost a lot of the temple laws, the laws concerning how to conduct the temple.
Yeah, so they just wouldn't be applicable if there's no temple,
They're
right? Yeah.
still there,
Yeah,
but yeah.
the laws are still there, but just not able to be carried out. Okay, that's a good point, actually.
Now, you have to wonder, did the temple in Kirtland match all the requirements?
I don't think so.
That's a good question.
Maybe.
Maybe we need to talk to Stacy Cram about that, make sure the church is following the order of things. All right, we're going to jump to a different thing here, just because it illustrates what I think the author is wanting us to get from this chapter. He talks about a gentleman whose name is Y.C. James or Jimmy Yen, who lived from 1890 to 1990. He was a Chinese educator and an organizer known for his work in mass literacy and rural reconstruction, first in China and then in other countries such as Taiwan and the Philippines. And so he had a program, I guess you could call it, a plan of how he helped other people to improve their lives, to achieve these things in their neighborhoods and places where they lived. So first of all, go to the people. You have to be with the people to understand the people, live among them, learn from them, love them, serve them, plan with them, start with what they know, and build on what they have. Anybody have any thoughts or reaction to that, Sharon?
Well, it reminded me about Reach International and their approach of participatory human development. That you go into a place and you live with them and you find out what's going on and what their priorities are and what they know and what they don't know. You don't go in with a plan, you go in to discover what
The plan needs to be, yeah, in conjunction with the individuals who are helping.
Sounds kind of like ministry 101 for missionaries.
Yeah. Sounds a lot to me like Jesus, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I could identify something from each one of those items that Jesus probably did.
You know, back in my early volunteer days, back in the 1960s, there was a concept called the Mother Bountiful Complex. And basically it was against all those. It was basically saying that a lot of volunteers went in with a preconceived notion of what people needed, how to cure their problems and all that sort of thing.
Yep.
And the movement, the volunteer movement at that point was headed towards exactly what's described there, trying to get volunteers to think about what the people needed by living among them and learning from them.
Yeah, that's very true. And I've probably mentioned this before, but KU Medical Center is getting very involved in global health initiatives. And in the past, we just sent surgical teams out or medical teams, and you kind of went in sort of like doctors used to do. You tell the people what they needed, and I'm here to fix you, kind of an attitude. And now anybody that goes on global health trips for KU has to first take training, pretty extensive training. And one of the things that they teach include these kinds of items. We're going to go in and assess the needs based on what they perceive the requirements are, and then we'll work with them using the resources that they have to maybe see how they can be helped. So
That's definitely not how they treated the American Indians when they came here.
Definitely not. All right, so starting where you are, Jesus' strategy for transforming Israel was very similar to that of Jimmy Yen's. By emphasizing the law and the prophets, Jesus started with what the people knew and built upon what they had. Interestingly enough, Jimmy Yen was a follower of Jesus, but he often criticized the missionaries who did not concern themselves with the lives and needs of people in the rural villages. That made me kind of think, we had the big missionary effort in this church in the 1840s, when we were all still one church. And then we've had, missionary efforts in the 50s and 60s of the last millennium. And, we sent people to Tahiti and to England and I guess all over the place. Where else? Haiti. I wonder what our attitudes were when we went into those places, if we really had the best interests of people at heart, according to, Jimmy Yen's kind of formula there. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just
Well, and then you had examples,
interesting to know more.
like Dr. Blumenschein.
Yeah, yeah.
Took his family down and lived with,
Yeah.
and then I forget the guy who was in Honduras, I forget his name, who lived among the people.
What was his name?
Dead guy.
Good guy.
Dead guy, thank you,
Yeah.
who kind of went on that model to what the people need.
I think my mother told me that Dr. Blumenschein delivered my brother before he.
He was mom's kind of.
Yeah, he
mom's
was at the
substitute.
Penn, I guess, for a while before he moved his family.
Yeah.
All right, so starting where the people are affirms their dignity and their culture. And so Jesus was standing before the people speaking in the tradition of Torah law. So what did Jesus mean that he would fulfill the law? What do you think the rabbis would say about fulfilling the law? What does that word mean to you?
It means to me observing like the dietary laws, purity laws, not doing harm to other people.
So you're saying he's actually going to obey the law.
Well, in his own way.
He came to be the sacrifice to, take upon himself the sins of the world. And that was one of the things he fulfilled.
Okay. Does the word negate the law come into mind, anybody's mind, based on, what you've heard in the past, or is he going to get rid of the law? Yeah, I saw his hand. I just wanted to ask the question. Jim, did you have something you want to say?
One of the purposes of Christ dying on the cross, of course, he knew that no one could 100% keep 613 laws. He knew that we couldn't do that. It was impossible. If we did, we'd be perfect like God. Christ died on the cross for our sins. And that is the truth. And that's what I believe, and that's what I was taught. And that
Most
church in
people-
Mapleton, Kansas, and all the preachers down there believe the same thing. So he died on the cross for our sins. He took on sin for us. Okay?
Okay, so
And he also made it possible that we could do the best we can, and that's what forgiveness is all about, and that's what praying and asking for forgiveness, and to strive forward and to do the best we can. There's no way we can keep 613 laws. And the Sanhedrin, the leaders of the Jewish church then, they couldn't do it either. They were neglecting the poor people, the widows. They wore the best of clothing, and they had the best of everything. They looked their nose down at the poor. And why did Christ go into the temple and upset the money changers? They were taking undue advantage of the poor people.
So let me ask you, you mentioned that this idea that Jesus was perfect, and I think everybody in this room would probably agree with that as well. If Jesus was perfect, do you think, Jim, that he kept all 613 elements of the law? Do you think he was perfect enough to do that? And I'm just asking because this is in the book. This
Being the Son of God, of course.
Okay.
So you couldn't expect human beings that are not God to do such a thing. And neither could the Jewish leaders.
So this is going right into our next point.
They pretended like they did and lorded it over on the common people.
That's why I asked you the question, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about. So one Jewish interpretation is that the Messiah, which the Jews expected, was a person who would be able to perfectly keep all 613 commandments. Now, there is not consensus about this from all of the Jewish traditions, but I think at least some of the Jewish traditions would suggest this. And of course, many Christians, as we've just said, would agree that Jesus was sinless. So, would that be fulfilling the law? Many Jewish people believe that the Messiah would guide others to keeping the law. Does it sound like our scripture today? Does it sound like Jesus was talking about that? Certainly sounded to me like he was teaching that. Okay, don't, not one jot or stroke is going to pass away before everything's going to be fulfilled. And if you want to get in the kingdom, better pay attention to this stuff. Okay, so he certainly seemed like a guide. Now, back to, was it Arlene or somebody that said something earlier? What do the Christians say? What did Paul say about the law?
Saved by grace.
Okay, saved by grace. Does that nullify or negate in any way the law of Moses?
I don't,
Kind of.
but try to fulfill the law in a way that was respectful of people, that the law was made for the people, not the people were made for, well,
Law, yeah. He said the Sabbath was made for humans, not the other way around.
whereas
But the law could be
the
set.
laws were
Right.
being
The law was made for
prescribed
people,
in a
not
way
people
that
for
was
the law.
being harsh and
Okay.
burdensome, where he was trying to relieve some of the burden and saying, well, that says, but I tell you this, and going beyond what the law.
So this is one of the most difficult things, I think, in Christian theology that we have very little agreement on. There's lots of disagreement in the Christian community with respect to the role of the law and the role of grace, and how do the two interface with each other, or does one replace the other? So what did Jesus mean that he would fulfill the law? What would the Christians have said? So there's like a spectrum. There's lots of opinions along that spectrum. And so there's a lack of consensus in what Christians believe. Remember, the Gospels were written by early Christians several decades after Jesus' death, each with a distinct perspective and interpretation of the law. Matthew may have been a little bit more favorable toward the law, because who was Matthew writing for? The Jewish Christians, right? The early Jews that had converted to being followers of Jesus. So the texts were shaped by the early Christian community, which is likely to have selected, reshaped, or even introduced new teachings that were, regarding Jesus' teachings of the law of Moses. Now, Paul preached that the Jews and the Gentiles are justified. Justification is to be made pure, or to be made righteous by having faith in the risen Jesus, not by following the law. And Paul walked a fine line. He had problems because he had people in his sphere of influence who were Jewish Christians, and he had people in his sphere of influence who were Gentile Christians. And one of the great fights that battles that we've talked about in the early church was the question of whether the Gentiles needed to follow the law of Moses. And Paul staunchly advocated against that. For the Gentiles. And he said, for the Jews, it's fine. You guys follow the law, but for the Gentiles, especially, you are, saved by the grace of Christ and the grace of God expressed through Christ, through the sacrifice, and you don't have to follow the Mosaic law. So this is a discussion, a disagreement that's been going on for a long time. Okay, Paul wrote and preached in the 40s and 50s and maybe early 60s, the Common Era. We're now into 2026, so almost 2,000 years. These discussions have been talked about between the theologians and the faithful. So for Paul, the purpose of the Mosaic law was to guard the people until faith comes. That would be Christ. And he wrote in Galatians, so the law was our guardian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. So Paul clearly is expressing his belief, which I think is in conflict with what we're reading about Jesus today, about the role of the law. Would you agree or disagree with that? Is my assessment off base, or do you think we're on target?
Well, when Paul went back to Jerusalem and met with the leaders of the Jerusalem church, there were some things he had to abide by. And one of them was, I think they call it I'm not sure I pronounced it right, the Noahic law or code. There were some requirements that if you wanted to be a God-fearer in the Jewish congregation, you had to, those were put on his people he was converting.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like he just threw the law out.
Well, that was but I think the discussion was that the Jewish elements in early Christianity wanted the law to be preserved and wanted it to apply to everybody. Paul disagreed with that, but you're right. When he went back to Jerusalem, he observed the law.
Well, that was a requirement they imposed, that
Yeah.
he was to impose on his congregation, the way I
But I
understand.
don't think he believed that. He certainly didn't write that.
He agreed to it, though.
I think he may have hedged his bet there a little bit.
It might have been the compromise.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a contract with someone and you fulfill that contract, you're no longer bound by that contract.
Yeah.
So that's another possible approach to, in fact, follows up with.
So that's another, I don't know that I really had that embedded in, but that's good that you brought that up because that is one of the explanations in Christianity that this is a new covenant now and the old covenants are being done away with. Have you ever heard that language? Mm-hmm. And some people would say, I don't know, a covenant with God is a covenant with God. That's usually, pretty fast and long lasting. So that's another disagreement. That's another theological discussion that we could have is, whether those covenants of the Old Testament have passed away and been replaced by the new covenant, which, there's language in the New Testament to support that, but not everybody accepts it. Make sense?
It only happened because the Gentile congregation went out. The Jewish congregation basically lost because of the war.
Right.
I do remember what Jesus said throughout his life when he was speaking to the Pharisees and criticizing the way that they followed the law, that they were missing the spirit of the law.
Okay.
That's what I kept coming back to.
Yeah.
So it's just hard to say that he needed to follow all 613 laws because some of them were stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, we don't follow. It's not expected now. We all see, and some of them were just some weird tradition that they were following.
Okay. Well,
That was back then, though. I mean,
I know, but there's a lot of them on the books now that nobody follows. It's funny to go back and look at some of our small towns, some of the laws they still have on the books, and you all look at that going, what? Because it was written during their cultural times, and even Jesus said, no, let's talk about love.
So now that I have you deeply immersed in some of the difficulties in interpreting the relationship of Jesus and the law, let's move toward the point that Jane just made. I got just a little bit more here on what Christians believe about Jesus and the law. So there are Orthodox Christians and other offshoots who regard the law of Moses as still fully in effect, but transformed and fulfilled in new ways. And so combined with the new covenant, not in lieu of it. So this would be an answer to the question of, was the covenant replaced? And so this is a group of Christians whose theology suggests that we may have a new and improved covenant, but that doesn't mean that the old covenant has necessarily gone away. Other Christians believe that only the parts called the moral law are still in effect. Ceremonial laws are no longer binding. And so Jane mentioned last week, I think there are always lots of movements about we got to have the 10 Commandments in the courthouse or in the school or, whatever. And why do people, still advocate for that? Why don't we put the Sermon on the Mount in the courthouse? Which to me seems a lot more current.
Do we have an answer to that? Mm-hmm. Do we have an answer to that one?
I don't have an answer to it, but I think you brought up the question, didn't you?
Well,
so these would be the Christians who would say, yeah, we like the 10 Commandments, the moral code that, we don't need all that. The altar has to be 5 feet by 6 feet and whatever else is going on there. Then there are dual covenant theologians who believe that the old covenant remains valid only for Jewish people, and Christians have a new covenant with God that has replaced the law. So that would be what Jonathan, I think, was kind of referring to.
There are some Jewish sects that do say that, right? I mean, is that with the kosher laws and all of that?
Oh, I can't really, some of them, yes, still follow the kosher.
They
law.
do.
I mean,
They do.
Yeah,
I know my, Phyllis, one of my in-laws, they keep kosher because one of the daughters wanted to keep kosher. Both the girls keep kosher no matter where they are, whereas the parents keep kosher only in the house.
Did kosher mean 613 laws? What is
No,
Those are the food laws.
it's a
Dietary
law.
So if I'm a Jewish person that wants all 613, what am I called?
It's probably orthodox.
A fanatic.
Yeah, so I think there are different levels of Judaism,
okay,
and the more Orthodox Jewish people would probably be more prone to try to keep those laws. I have
Okay.
lots of Jewish friends at work who are more along the lines of the Reform, and I've been out to dinner with them, and they ordered the seafood and the shrimp and whatever else.
Me.
Yeah, so
There are people who keep kosher.
and so some do. And
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
that's like my
My
in-laws, they have to set the dishes, and when they keep kosher because of their daughters. They were not raised kosher. Well, a big argument both I had with my ex, he swore up and down that his parents kept a kosher house, but my sister-in-law, they did.
Okay.
Plus,
Okay.
my ex would bring in pepperoni pizza and seafood, so there's no way the house was kosher.
so Debbie gets the last word on food, and then we're going to
Okay.
I'm getting hungry.
At Village Shalom, there were, when Jerry first went on his floor, there were two people that got kosher meals. One of them was served by a relative because she needed help getting, but not on Saturday. They hired somebody to take that man. His name was Moshe, which is probably Moses.
Moses, yeah.
And so they hired someone to come, like a caregiver, to come in and feed her on Saturdays so Moshe could keep kosher. But there's
That's the Sabbath law.
it was and it was just, it's amazing what I'm seeing on Jerry's floor that is inspiring me to want to know more.
Yeah, so people truly are practicing
Yes.
the Mosaic law in it as it was.
But not all the Jewish people on that floor are doing it.
That would
But
be kind of cool.
yeah, it is.
All right, so if Jesus fulfilled the law, this is what I asked you to think about earlier. Why are there stories in which he appears to break the law? And then he, kind of goes into the discussion about anybody that breaks these laws not getting into the kingdom. So the Gospels show Jesus acting in ways that might appear to override or alter certain rules, such as healing on the Sabbath, that's in Mark 3, or redefining ritual hand washing customs from Mark 7.
Mm.
So what do you think about that? How can we rationalize Jesus sort of breaking the law, I guess, if we think that Jesus kept the law?
The big one that he broke too was going into the people with leprosy.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Yeah,
made
having
him-
contact with the sick. Yeah. But, when he healed them, he did say, go show yourself to the priest, because, that's the law. The priest is the one who can clear you and authorize you to go back into the temple again.
So you think he broke the law you're saying he broke the law to heal somebody? It is against the law to touch somebody with leprosy. Or do you just...
Well, I think you have to have purification rites, you have to do the washing and so forth.
Part of the purity laws. And I think he was trying to say that, okay, hand washing is a ritual, but what's inside you is, if what's inside you is dirty, how can you be pure?
But there's a lot of, so this is my medical person coming out here. There's a lot of practical sense in some of the Mosaic laws to avoid spreading disease. So if you wash your hands after you've touched a person with an illness, the likelihood that you'll spread that illness will be much less.
Definitely.
So in addition to theological implications of the Mosaic Law. There's also many of them that have practical
Yeah.
applications.
Well, wasn't that some of the purposes of some of these laws we think are archaic or whatever, were at that time maybe health-wise important?
Yeah, I think so.
Very important.
Yeah. All right. Jesus did pay the temple tax and instructed others to do it, so he kept that law. Okay. People wondered why they had to pay the tax to the temple, and he said, that's the law. So does the disparity in his approach, sort of being selective about which things he would keep and which things he might violate, certainly because it was for the good of somebody else. I mean, it's not that he was doing it for malicious reasons. But do these episodes create any questions about what Jesus believed?
Well, almost every time though you say he violated, he said he would cite something else that said, look at this, what happened there. I'm not saying, I don't know as I believe he violated it. I think he was fulfilling the intent of what they originally meant. And so I guess I have a little bit of problem saying he broke laws.
Well, he definitely did according to the higher ups and the Jewish.
Yeah, according to them, but was he breaking oral tradition or was he breaking the Torah? Was the oral tradition given by the higher ups that Pauline's talking about?
I think it goes back to what Jane said earlier. It's the spirit of it.
Yeah.
And it's interpreted differently by different groups.
Okay, we're on a good track. We're going to keep moving forward here.
Well, I noticed that Mark is the one that had him doing these kind of rebel things, and Matthew had him pay the temple tax.
Well, and I will.
Matthew was writing for the Jewish audience.
I can get away with it in
Particular
Mark.
scripture about fulfilling the law is only in Matthew.
Right.
I keep looking for it because every time I read something, I look at the other gospels to see what they said.
Yeah.
I like to compare my witnesses.
Well, and as we said, Matthew would make sense that Matthew would emphasize the law because Matthew was writing for the Jewish Christians. So
why did he have to say fulfill the law? And then that became kind of the Christian debate. It's like, well, the other guys didn't say it.
Yeah.
They
Maybe
were biased.
They were all biased.
They were all biased. That is true.
So this is what I think Dennis was trying to say here. Jesus was revealing the profound intent in the law to be a living instrument of love and mercy, which led him to a different interpretation of the law than some of the Pharisees had.
Okay.
Does that agree with, are we on the same wavelength now, Dennis?
Well, I think the intent was what Jesus was after.
Paul?
Yep.
Love and mercy, those two things were missing in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership.
Yeah.
You see? That's what the point that Christ is trying to get across to the leadership of the Jewish church. They didn't have love or mercy.
Well, not entirely so, Jim, because they talked about how to treat the foreigners in your own land. I mean, there were aspects of love and mercy in the old Judaic law.
Mm-hmm.
We focus on that difference, but it's not 100% accurate.
Yeah, I think based on what the New Testament tells us, there certainly were members of the Jewish hierarchy that probably were not living up to the standard of love and mercy that we would like to have seen. It doesn't mean, like Jonathan said, that doesn't exist in the Old Testament. It very definitely is there. I mean, the prophets talked about it. That's what Isaiah and Jeremiah, many of the Old Testament prophets, were trying to get the people to love the marginalized, and care for the poor and the sick and the widowed and so forth.
And the two greatest commandments, they come straight out of the Old Testament.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to keep moving on because you guys are just you're my class for me here. So Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." We read that. We know that Matthew was writing for the early Jewish Christians who were not separated from Judaism. Just a little bit about the word abolish means to dismantle or tear down. And Matthew is starting where the people are and with what they know to help them understand the good news. So this is back to Jimmy Yen. Start with the people where they are. Should all 613 commandments of the law be of equal importance? I think we've already kind of stated that we don't think that that's necessary. But then Jesus goes on to say, you shall love the Lord your God he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. I just heard somebody say that in the last minute. Okay, Dennis. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Are these two commandments part of the 10 commandments, as far as anybody knows?
Not really.
No.
Okay, they're not. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind is from the Shema prayer, and that's in Deuteronomy 6. And love your neighbor as yourself is from Leviticus 19:18. So they're found in the Pentateuch. These are the first 5 books of the Bible. I don't think that they're necessarily official laws of the law of Moses, but Jesus definitely was embracing these. So what was Jesus trying to say here? What does he mean by the word hang? On all of this hangs the law and the prophets. Hang means to depend on, to be based on, to be a variation of, or to stem from.
I think that it means that without loving God with everything and loving your neighbor as yourself, then the law has no meaning. That you have to have love in order for the law to have meaning.
Yeah, I think, a lot of times we view the Mosaic law, and I've heard this said, and it might even be in the New Testament somewhere, that the Mosaic law was a harsh, kind of like an overseer. We have that feeling about the Old Testament laws. And Jesus is reinterpreting that for the people who are listening to his Sermon on the Mount and saying that this is an expression of God's love for you, and that's why the law was given. And it needs to be applied in that same way as you go forward. So that's a little different take on that.
When you think about in the Old Testament, it says, well, and that's what they were doing in the New Testament. The woman was caught in adultery. They said, stone her.
Stoning,
And then
yep.
Jesus says, well, guy without sin cast the first stone.
So, yeah. So a reinterpretation of the law based on what Jim said, the love and the mercy that Jesus didn't see always present in the society of his day, and that the prophets didn't always recognize in their times. So these 2 commandments summarize all the other commandments and state their intent. This was the intent of the law, was to make the world a better place, to make life better for people, not harder for people. So love the Lord your God. The first of what Jesus said, this is actually the first 4 of the 10 commandments, loving God, and loving your neighbor as yourself is the last 6 of the 10 commandments. Let's look at the 10 commandments. And so the first 4, no other gods, no idols, don't take the name of God in vain, and keep the Sabbath day. So the first 4, love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The last 6, honor father and mother, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't covet. That's caring for your neighbor. Okay. So the 10 commandments are very basic and sound, pretty harsh. But if we look at the intent of what they were given for, it starts to make sense that God was expressing a way of loving people through giving them some rules. Agree, disagree?
The 10 Commandments also emphasize more, thou shalt not, don't do this.
Yeah.
Whereas the 2 Commandments are more positive.
Yeah, more positive. Yeah, the things you should do. I would agree with that. So these ideas would not be new to Matthew's readers. Jesus demonstrated that right interpretation of the Torah must view all of God's commands through the lens of the weightier matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And I think that's from one of the author's statements. Jesus cites Hosea 6:6 and Matthew 9:13 and 12:7, emphasizing mercy as central to the reading of and obedience to the Torah. And he highlights the love of neighbor as the pinnacle command of the Torah. And that's also from the Sermon on the Mount. Not St. Matthew there, by the way. High school yearbook or something, I'm not sure. The message of Matthew 22:34-40 emphasizes that the Torah is rightly understood when it's read through the central lens of love for God and love for neighbor, and even enemies can be considered our neighbors. So the story of the fellow on the road that was
Good Samaritan
beaten up, and the only person that took care of him was the
was the
Samaritan,
Samaritan
who was the enemy of the Jews. Okay, the sheer breadth of these two commands makes obedience to them a lifelong effort. Okay, so any questions about where Jesus stood with the law? Are we now all on the same, sort of in the same parking lot?
Probably not.
Probably not.
We might be in the same area.
Same
Same
district.
city.
Same,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, just there's a little bit more in this chapter. He talks about the prophets. So what's a prophet? In the Old Testament, the major prophets were Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then there were a dozen minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay. And the greatest of all the prophets, who's not actually listed in those because he doesn't have a book in the Bible under his name, is Moses. At least in the
He has
Judaic.
5 books.
The Judaic. What's that?
He has 5 books.
He has 5 books, but they're just not named after him.
No.
So what's a prophet do? I mean, we kind of have a sense in our church of the prophetic voice, but not thinking about that. What was the role, the calling, sort of the purpose of the Old Testament prophets?
I kind of see it as calling people back to righteousness, remembering the widow, the orphan, the stranger.
Yeah. Anybody agree, disagree?
And
I agree.
an interpreter of when I think about what's written in the books of the prophet, they're almost always in some way, shape, or form an interpretation of what God would want, what God has to say about a particular thing. So they were spokespeople.
I like that. And as I was reading through this lesson and kind of learning what I learned about the law, and I was sort of surprised to hear that maybe elements of the Mosaic law were not quite as ancient as I used to assume that they were. It gave me a new insight into the purpose of the prophets, because they were, for the people of their times, the law. They were the ones who were expressing the law even before maybe some of it had even been written down. You know, you're talking about Israel or Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all about 700, 750, 600 BCE, so a long time ago. Right. And then our author says, gives a quote from a fellow named Abraham Joshua Heschel. That's his picture there. And he said, the prophet is thrown into orations about widows and orphans, about the corruption of judges and affairs of the marketplace. The prophets take us to the slums. Prophecy is a voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. God is raging in the prophet's words. The prophet's word is a scream in the night. That's a powerful statement.
So where are today's Old Testament prophets?
Well, I was going to ask you, does that sound like a prophet in the community of Christ? Are they raging, screaming in the night? They might be, we just don't know.
Softly.
I think there's still a call in this movement. I mean, we hear it all the time from the World Church, the call to love people and to reach out to those in need.
Yeah. Defend justice.
Yeah, peace and justice. So they might not be quite as vigorous in their presentation. It's a little more measured, but I think the message is the same. God wants us to care for each other. God wants us to love our neighbors. Make sense?
Well, they took some rather radical measures back then. Didn't want them walk around naked for 3 years or something like that with
Yeah.
a yoke on his neck.
Probably.
I don't think that was a community of Christ problem.
Yeah, I think-
That's Old Testament.
That's what I mean, that back then they took some radical.
I'm just clarifying.
It wasn't FM Smith or anybody like that. But certainly would get attention, right? All right, some points to ponder. What are the goals of the prophet for the community? For what do they advocate? I think we've kind of addressed that. Would a prophet advocate for competition or cooperation among people?
Cooperation.
We have a lot of competition in our world.
Yeah. Why can't we have both?
Maybe we just need to restore the balance a little bit. Maybe we can.
I like that.
Because it seems like we live very much in a world that competition is the prize and cooperation is not observed as readily. And what does it mean to stand with and speak for the widow, the orphan, or the stranger today?
Do it under the least of these, you do it under me.
Justice.
Justice, okay.
And it's not very popular today.
Yeah.
Speak up for anybody.
It really isn't.
I think there's a lot of rhetoric. I don't always see a lot of action.
Yeah.
I think, and my response to this would be it's more than just to speak the talk, it's to walk the walk. And we have, I know people in this congregation involved with the Center for Hope and different organizations that are, Operation Breakthrough, organizations that definitely recognize the worth of persons and reach out. I think that's important. That's a prophetic message to see somebody rendering that kind of service without speaking. What was it Gandhi said? Preach often, but sometimes use words or something like that.
Yeah. There was over $200 donated for the Center of Hope in
That's awesome.
Emory Plea.
Thank you for doing that, by the way. I appreciated that they mentioned that yesterday, that Ron mentioned it. All right, Moses resisted the Pharaoh of Egypt to deliver God's people. Who are the Pharaohs today? I'm not going to ask you to respond to that one. Who are today's prophets who are resisting them? And where are we as disciples called to be? We'll let you think about that. Okay. And Jewish philosopher by the name of Michael Walzer says the Exodus narrative is the taproot of all revolutions in the modern world. What do you think that means? The Exodus narrative. It would be the deliverance of people from bondage.
Mm-hmm.
He says that's the taproot, that's the root that gets down into the soil and gets the water to the tree that nourishes the tree.
When I read that, I had a little bit of a problem with it, but I do think in the sense that it took a person, Moses, at least historically, to lead people.
It always takes people to stand up.
Yeah.
If people don't stand up, it doesn't happen, right? So I think that's the point.
We use that word grassroots movements.
Sorry, what?
We use the term grassroots movements.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a revolutionary.
Yeah, and we talked about that. Was it the last book where we looked at all the different movements that were going on in the United States? People had, started something, and some of them we hadn't even heard of, but they were out doing good things and
To the coffee.
helping people. All right, I didn't think we were going to make it, but you guys fed right into the river, and we got there. It worked.
And I'm going to add to that, please read chapter 7, because I think we'll get through 6 and 7.
Okay. Chapter 6 and 7.
It doesn't hurt to read ahead anyway.
Yeah.
So our challenge for, not next week, because next week is the congregational meeting.
Oh, that's true. We have a meeting.
Following the week, the challenge is for the class to make it impossible for Dennis to go beyond chapter 6.
So read the book and come with lots of questions for that.